Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here, and I'd also like to welcome those who are joining us online or who will be watching this after the fact when it is streaming on our YouTube channel. My name is Stephen Collis. I'm thrilled to be able to be here today. I am a law professor here at the University of Texas and the faculty director of the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center, and we are just thrilled to be able to host Professor Asma Uddin and Emma Green to talk about a very timely topic in relation to religious liberty law here in the United States. So I'm going to do what is the most important thing for me, which is introduce these two wonderful speakers and then get out of the way so that Emma can guide us all in a wonderful conversation with Asma about her scholarship. Let me first introduce both of them. Asma T. Uddin is a professor, author, and lawyer specializing in religious liberty. Her recent major publications include When Islam is Not a Religion, The Politics of Vulnerability, and Religious Liberty Interest Convergence in the William and Mary Law Review. Uddin is currently visiting assistant professor of law at the Catholic University of America, where she teaches family law, international human rights, and gender law and policy. After graduating from the University of Chicago Law School, Uddin served as counsel for the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and as a fellow with the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program in Washington, D.C. She served 2 terms as an expert advisor on religious liberty to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and has held fellowships at Harvard, Georgetown, and UCLA. In addition to her legal work, Uddin writes and speaks on Muslims and gender. As the founding editor-in-chief of altmuslimima.com, she managed the web magazine and organized vigorous debates and conferences on the multifaceted issues of gender, politics, and religion. Uddin has advised numerous media projects on American Muslims, including most recently as executive producer for the Emmy and Peabody-nominated docuseries, The Secret Life of Muslims. She is joined today by Emma Green. Emma is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she covers cultural conflicts in academia. She was previously a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covered religion and politics and led a series called The Atlantic Interview. Her reporting was regularly featured on The Experiment, a podcast collaboration between The Atlantic and WNYC. In 2020, Emma was the laureate of the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters, and in 2021, she won awards from the Religion News Association in magazine journalism and feature writing. Her work has been anthologized in several books, including The American Crisis and The God Beat. Emma has spoken at Princeton, the University of Chicago, Notre Dame, and other universities across the country, including now the University of Texas. She has written for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and her work has been featured on This American Life and NPR, among other outlets. She lives in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Emma and Asma to the University of Texas. I'll let you two take it away. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Steve, so much. And thank you also to Sandra Garcia, who helped us so much in getting here, and to the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center generally for hosting us. It's such a pleasure to be here in Texas, and especially to be here in Texas with Asma, who I've had the pleasure of being in conversation with before, and I always find her to be such a thoughtful interlocutor. I think you all are in for a great conversation with her today. So I want to start off by clarifying the title of the event. We've already gotten a couple of questions from people about this phrase that we used in the title, post-Christian nation. So what did you mean when you suggested that that be part of the title of the event today?
Sure, well, thank you. Thank you, Emma. Many thanks to Steve and Sandra and the University of Texas, and for all of you for coming out. So yeah, that phrase, post-Christian America, I thought long and hard, first about putting it on my book cover, making it part of my book title, and then, of course, once I kind of accepted that and all the sort of repercussions that that was gonna bring, it's just an easy step to also include it in the title of my talk. And I think, so what I meant by it, and what's really interesting about the phrase is I think a lot of people can kind of interpret it in their own ways, and that's exactly what has happened. But my book is called The Politics of Vulnerability: How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America. And the idea there was not to kind of sort of make a claim that non-Christians have taken over, or that America has sort of, in a very sort of essential way, lost its Christian character, et cetera. But it was really kind of tied to the question of vulnerability. And you can see the title, Politics and Vulnerability, but not really understand what that means. And so I was trying to make it more, sort of raise some ideas for the person kind of just looking at it, judging the book by its cover, as to what I might be referring to. And that, for me, was simply the fact, well documented, that specifically white Protestants are a minority in this country. So there's a number of sort of demographic trends that I trace in the book. One, sort of decline of white Americans generally. So there's that decline. There's like the purely racial part of this. And then specifically the religious decline of white Protestants, or Protestants actually, for the first time are a minority in this country. And then also, I think most importantly for purposes of my analysis is the extent to which these particular declines have also been reflected in the extent to which Protestant Christianity is reflected in the sort of dominant institutions in this country.
So before we get into some of your arguments about legal work, which is where most of your focus is, I want to build off of that and get you to give us a sort of state of the faiths, the state of the relationship between Muslims and Christians in the United States, some of the challenges that you still see in the way that Christians think and talk about Muslims, and also perceptions in the Muslim community and among Muslim communities about what it means to be in relationship with Christians in America.
Yeah, I think at the outset, it's also the question of when you say Muslim-Christian relations, I mean, many people, the first question they ask are, which Muslims and which Christians? And I think in the book, for the Muslim question, I have a lot in there about sort of the way that these particular religious groups have become aligned, whether intentionally or unintentionally, with one or the other political tribe. And I'll get into that in a bit. But for purposes of that particular tension, it was, to me, not necessary to actually distinguish which Muslims I'm talking about, because I think in that sort of like the way the dynamic plays out and in the American imagination, there isn't a lot of distinctions that are made among different groups of Muslims. I mean, it's hard enough just to try to get Americans to think about American Muslims without also sort of conflating them with Muslims in every Muslim majority country abroad, and certainly the ones where troublesome things are happening, right? So an American Muslim like me, born and raised in Miami, Florida, is somehow asked to answer for something that is happening in Nigeria. I mean, there's no connection, but there's a difficulty, I think, that many Americans have in sort of being very precise when it comes to American Muslims. And then on the question of Christians, specific to the topic of like how to sort of, I didn't want to just make this generalization that there is this hostility. I used polling data to kind of show that there is, in fact, a really high level of animus against Muslims, and it's represented in a number of different ways. Everything from the way that people respond to some of these surveys, the things that people say, but also, including acts of violence. And so for purposes of that, like a lot of the data really was about white evangelicals. I mean, that's just what everybody was writing about and talking about, certainly during the Trump era, because there was so much about white evangelicals supporting him and putting him in office. So there is, I spent a significant amount of time I actually have an entire part of the book, like this entire large section, that answers the question, which Christians? And so the one thing I do, I look at white evangelicals, and I also distinguish white conservative evangelicals from Christian nationalists, because that, I think, is an important distinction, especially because my book is about healing Muslim-Christian relations, which is another way of saying bridge building, and I think a lot of people would think and have actually said, why would you want to bridge build with these people? And so I want to make sure I'm making distinctions among people who could be classified as Christian nationalists, which I think it's a harder argument to make, that there's a possibility of bridge building versus this particular group. And the last thing I would say is that even though I have this focus on white conservative evangelicals, I think a lot of the bigger sort of social and cultural issues, and certainly the battles at the US Supreme Court, extend well beyond white evangelicals to include conservative Catholics and other conservative Christians.
So I want to spend a few minutes talking through the history of how we got to this state of the faiths that you've just described, an opportunity for coalition building, but certainly some extent of mutual misunderstanding or mutual mistrust. So you spent a lot of time in your first book talking about the way that 9/11 conditioned the way that Americans understand what Islam is, and also attitudes towards the kinds of liberties that Muslims should be afforded. And I think that also extends to the legal world, the way that legal rights are extended to Muslims, the way that legal groups think about that question. So, you know, that's a huge topic. How did 9/11 affect Muslim-Christian relations in the United States? But I'd love for you to just give us a couple of highlights of the way that you think that 9/11 and the concern about security really shaped the foundation of where we are today, thinking about Muslim religious freedom.
Sure. So the first book, the one that Emma's referring to, is titled When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. I wrote it after Trump was elected, and it was published in 2019. So right in the middle of just so much that was going on at the courts and the public, the public arena in politics and elsewhere, that was really kind of pitting Christians against Muslims. And you know, so this idea of when Islam is not a religion is about tackling this claim that sometimes is made very explicitly, including, as I talk about in the book, in the context of at least one court case where it was argued that in the Muslim community, in this case Murfreesboro, Tennessee, should not be permitted to build a mosque because, and this was actually argued in court, Islam is not a religion. And so the laws that are there to protect and sort of facilitate the building of houses of worship should not be applicable to this particular religious community because, again, they're only applicable to religions, and the claim was that Islam is not a religion. And then that raises the question, like, what is it? And in fact, it was also answered by the advocates in this case, and they were saying that it is a dangerous political ideology. You cannot allow this mosque to be built because it's going to be a training ground for terrorists. And I trace this idea, whether it shows up in those particular sort of words, Islam is not a religion, which, speaking to my context at the Department of Justice, is not as rare as we'd like to think. It has actually come up in sort of the public advocacy against not just the building of mosques, but also the construction of Muslim cemeteries. Which is, I think, particularly sort of jarring for me, that not even the question of life and death can kind of make us think about our common humanity. But I think that answer about it being a dangerous political ideology, I don't think it started with 9/11, but I certainly think that it was something that helped amplify that message and make it more believable for more Americans.
And fasting forward a little bit, you mentioned that your book was published during the Trump era, and that was another time that I think of as a real time of ferment and anxiety for American Muslims and the relationship between Christians and Muslims, particularly when it came to politics. So just talk a little bit about that. What were some of the things that happened during the Trump presidency, which now seems like such a faraway time, that really conditioned the way that Muslims think about their relationships with American Christians, but also potentially the way that American Christians are reacting to the rights that Muslims should have?
Well, I think for me, it's perfectly sort of encapsulated in the way that for Republicans, the 2016 election was actually called the religious liberty election. I mean, then candidate Ted Cruz called it that. And there's plenty of reporting on how at various sort of places where the Republican candidates were campaigning, they were all essentially competing with each other to demonstrate to the audience, to their respective constituencies, that they were the biggest defender for religious liberty. Like, this was the issue. And of course, often, it's like the bigger issue of religious liberty, and then the more sort of specific issues that came up, often dealing with challenges to the contraceptive mandate in the Affordable Care Act, and concerns about the facilitation of same-sex weddings. I mean, these are the sorts of things that were the specific issues being talked about. But it was definitely like, this is all about like the future of religious liberty. Who you elect is going to determine like the future of religious liberty and, of course, those religious claims in this country. But yet simultaneous to this sort of very passionate sort of advocacy for religious liberty was like every candidate was also competing to say who can come up with the most anti-Muslim measure, right? So former President Trump was saying, I mean, we all know about it, the Muslim ban, the Muslim registry. We had candidate Cruz kind of talking about surveilling Muslim neighborhoods, which to me was like a little bit confusing. I mean, there's some certain parts of the country where there might be a higher population of Muslims in certain neighborhoods, but I'm not aware of like Muslim neighborhoods generally. And so, again, then candidate Trump talking about shutting down mosques, plenty of support for like surveillance. I think Ben Carson made it a point to say Islam is different from Christianity, and therefore you can kind of fill in the blanks. And so to me that was just like, I mean, there was always kind of like being in the space, you kind of really kind of wonder about the extent to which people fully embrace the concept of religious liberty from a place of total integrity. But I think that just made it so obvious. It was kind of like maybe what was kind of below the surface was really coming above and becoming apparent. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think that was.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that you've described two really important events for shaping what I see as the consciousness of American Muslims, the way that they might perceive their status in the United States, their vulnerability. They might understand the way that Christians think about them. And what you've described is basically bad, that Muslims might perceive a lot of hostility, and that people who are of a certain religious or political background don't really see them as deserving of religious rights. So here's what I think of as the Asma twist, right? This is where you become a complicated figure, which is you spend a lot of time in your second book, and I think a lot of time in your work generally, sort of flipping that script and thinking about how you might empathize with where conservative Christians are coming from, both when they fear for their own religious liberty and potentially when they sort of misunderstand or misconstrue the way that Muslims' religious liberty cases should be made. So I wonder if you could talk about how you've sort of come to see the case for Christians when they perceive themselves in a place of vulnerability in America, how you've come to see that with a form of empathy.
Yeah, and I think part of it has to do with just being in the space and being exposed to people of diverse religions, including many of the conservative Christians who are bringing the claims in cases that I've worked on or otherwise supported. And just like understanding it, first I should say, like when you kind of approach it as a lawyer and you sort of understand the legal arguments, it's a lot easier, I think, to sort of like pierce through the political sort of cloud. And we were kind of joshing Emma about the role of media and confusing things. But I think it's absolutely, like I think if you don't have anything except the media to rely on, I think there's lots of misconceptions that I think people think are rightfully held. So I think being in that space, like understanding the issues from a legal perspective, but then also knowing who these people were as individuals, to me sort of like, raise a question of like things are not what they're made out to be. And I already had this impression kind of just like because of the work I do. And then of course, after having written the first book, I went on a book tour, which was like crazy. I was just like all over the country. This is pre-pandemic. And meeting with just like a diverse set of groups. Like there were people very much on the political left who were like very supportive of like this idea of like Islam and minority rights and the threat to minority rights, but then were kind of like very uncomfortable when I brought up the other part of my argument, which is that ultimately these protections are not just for minority groups, but in order for them to be effectively protected, you have to actually have this sort of coherence in your approach. So that was like my encounters on the left, and then there were these very conservative spaces where I was invited to speak. And I think the reason for that is because I am someone who worked on cases that are really contentious and that sort of advocate for Christians' rights. So it was sort of like a safer space for me to be in and for them, right, to actually invite a Muslim into their midst, which I don't think a lot of these groups had ever done before. And I just found that when I was in that space, even though of course I'm talking about a book that's primarily about these really problematic attacks coming from the right, their response was actually really open. Like one, the fact that they invited me, they gave a platform sometimes, like the plenary stage at a major like Christian conference, but then also just that they were willing to have an actual substantive conversation about Muslims' religious rights, which is like pretty shocking if you think about. I mean, I remember there was one conference, and I actually opened my second book with this, where I was preceded by Frank Gaffney, who is, for those of you who know, is like has made a living out of attacking Muslims. And actually, he actually went up there and warned everybody that I was. I think he called me a Sharia supremacist before I got on stage. So I'm in those spaces, and that experience made me kind of wonder, like, why? Like, what is it that I already kind of had an idea, but why is it that I am invited into these spaces? And, in that scenario, actually, they had security escort Frank Gaffney out, and the sort of profuse apology by both the host and the people in the audience. And it was just like, what is it? What makes this different? And I think ultimately it does go to the fact that there is a sense of just like kind of letting down their guard. Like, this is someone who's going to be able to talk about these issues, but talk about it in a way that's not necessarily set up as a counter to our own rights, but it's part of like a bigger coherent principle. And so that's what the second book is about. It's really kind of figuring that out, but going beyond my general sort of like my observations and looking at the empirical evidence behind sort of what makes humans act the way that they do, and then sort of applying that research to this particular puzzle.
So you make the argument in the second book, and also in some recent work that you've done, that there's an opportunity here to build coalitions between Muslims and Christians, both in a general political sense, but also in the legal world, for lawyers to work together on religious liberty cases, to see mutual interests in there being religious liberty for all, protections under the First Amendment for all. So I want you to give a vision of what that looks like. In our perfect kumbaya world, what would these kinds of coalitions look like to you?
So a perfect coalition would be one that sort of recognizes that each religion is different. We have very different beliefs, different practices, but there's an inherent sort of value, even if you don't agree with what the other, or even understand what the other practice is, but that is something that is worthy of protection under our law. And I think one case that kind of got me thinking, a lot of these cases got me thinking about it, but one that I ended up sort of running with is a case that was decided in December 2020, and it's Tanzin v. Denvir, and it involved three Muslim men, but the named plaintiff was Muhammad Denvir, and they were essentially put on the no-fly list by the FBI because they were essentially sort of like suspected terrorists, but the way that it was kind of like the evidence behind it was really kind of shady, and the whole idea was like, if you want to get off the no-fly list, then you have to spy on your Muslim communities. And they refused, and so this was a violation of their religious beliefs. And so the question in this case that ultimately was whether or not, their case was brought under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the question in the case was whether or not the fact that the FBI sort of essentially violated their religious practice by forcing them or trying to force them to spy in their communities, whether or not these plaintiffs can get money damages. And it was a unanimous decision in favor of the Muslim men, and it was actually really kind of interesting and surprising for me because the person who wrote, among many reasons, but one of the reasons was because the opinion was written by Justice Thomas. And Justice Thomas has sort of been talked about as somebody who espouses what Professor Cass Sunstein would call national security fundamentalism, that when it comes to national security, there are just, national security trumps civil rights in pretty much all cases. And so I explore in my recent paper why things change, why you see Justice Thomas essentially abdicating that position. And ultimately, there was lots of sort of murmuring in the public commentary that really this is just because these justices are thinking about conservative Christian interests that can be protected if you permit money damages. But to me, and I don't actually discount that. I think that's certainly part of it, which is why my paper is called Religious Liberty Interest Convergence, because it's a convergence of people's interests. But it kind of shows that even in scenarios where you might have justices or conservatives generally might have been a little squeamish about giving rights to people that the FBI was trying to, paint as terrorists, is like just a significant step forward, it seems to me. So even if you're not coming at it from a place of, total sort of like just if it's purely coming from a place of interest, self-interest, and I think it's still worth it because it still gets you somewhere.
So Kumbaya is obviously complicated, more complicated than we'd like to think. And there are plenty of scenarios where the kind of coalition that you imagine might play out in ways that upset people both on the right and on the left, depending on what the situation is. So to bring up one example, a case that is pending before the Supreme Court that is in a long line of cases in a similar genre called 303 Creative versus Lennis, which is basically about the rights of someone who creates wedding websites in Colorado to decline to make those wedding websites for people who are LGBTQ or who profess certain beliefs about marriage, for example, that this creator does not agree with. So this is part of a long line of cases that have been characterized by people on the left as pitting religious freedom, the religious freedom of a Christian who objects to gay marriage, against the rights of people who are LGBTQ. And this is often the way that the religious liberty debate gets framed in the United States. So I wonder how you would think through that kind of challenge from the left in this imagined coalition between Muslims and Christians, Christians of a particular group arguing that this wedding website maker should be able to decline to make a wedding website for a same-sex couple. How would you think about navigating that challenge, and what's the right thing for a Muslim lawyer to do, for Muslim political groups to do?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is really long with like many different subparts. But I guess
you got to think in short subparts, not law paper subparts.
Well, I mean, I actually do spend a lot of time in the second book, the part where in the book where I'm like sort of distinguishing Christian nationalists from conservative white evangelicals, and then again using sort of political science studies to make these distinctions. One of the things I note is that Christian nationalists take an offensive sort of position about like, it's all about essentially exclusion, kind of like this is what America's supposed to be, it's a Christian nation, these are the people who are supposed to be part of it, and these are the people who are not supposed to be part of it. And so that sort of thinking is what supports things like the travel ban. But then when you look at the empirical work on conservative white evangelicals, to the extent that there isn't an overlap there, the ones who can actually be separated out, they tend to take a defensive posture. They feel like they are essentially under threat, that the broader culture has essentially left them behind, and they're just trying to carve out their space to exist in America. And so a lot of these claims, they really kind of take that posture. Like they're really just about, we're not trying to change what America is, we're just trying to carve out our space in the culture. The other sort of research that I incorporated there was also the distinction between when these same people, like their sort of evolving attitudes toward racial minorities and religious minorities, including American Muslims, actually they become more open the more religious they become or religiously active, right? So the higher the rates of church attendance, the less likely they are to be prejudiced against religious and racial minorities. And yet the higher the rates of church attendance, they also tend to then become stronger believers in traditional notions of sexuality and marriage. And so there's something kind of there that I was like, this is interesting, and the way that it's explained is that there's something kind of considered essential to the faith, and traditional sexuality is considered really essential to what it means to be a devout Christian, whereas racism or animus against, or anyone honestly, but minorities is sort of thought of as really sort of alien to what it means to be a good Christian. And so, this really kind of got me thinking. I have another paper that I'm working on now where I kind of look at the narratives that are delivered to the Supreme Court through amicus briefs that I would call pro-religion advocates that really kind of try to like explore that what this is when someone refuses to make a website or refuses to make a cake is not just a simple act of discrimination, but that we actually have to complicate that narrative through a number of different ways. But I think one of the ways is by showing that this is something very specific to the act of facilitating same-sex weddings, but also something that's really core to what it means to be a Christian.
So I want to complicate that a little bit too, because one of the biggest cases that has come out from the Supreme Court recently has been the opposite of what you just described. It's not a narrow exception for specific groups of believers who are trying to respectfully find a way to honor their beliefs against the backdrop of a public accommodations law. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade. Now, this is a little bit different than some of the straightforward religious liberty cases because it wasn't narrowly a question about the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, whether compelled speech against someone's religious beliefs would violate their First Amendment rights. But certainly religion is very, very much tied up in the question of abortion and the question of whether Roe should be overturned. And I would say everybody, from multiple perspectives, would describe that case as one that didn't just apply narrowly to certain sets of believers, but rather changed the way that our society is shaped fundamentally on a really important and pressing and contentious issue. So I wonder how you think about that, how to deal with some of these really, really big questions for which religion is such an important part, that Muslims across the many Muslims in the United States, so many different viewpoints that they might have, and by the way, lots of different viewpoints among Christians as well, but how you would think about building and preserving coalitions when the question is not just about defending narrowly tailored exemptions for minorities, but rather big questions about how our society looks.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about Dobbs is that, in a way, it has kind of made the issue, or continue to make the issue one about exemptions, but this time an exemption for minority religious believers who have a different idea or theology about abortion. And I think, for a while, I think post-Dobbs, I think a number of religious liberty scholars were kind of skeptical that there would be a viable religious liberty claim, that, in each case, the government's going to say that has a compelling interest in protecting life and that ultimately, that justifies a restriction on people of different religions who believe something different. But there was actually this opinion that came out in December in a court in Indiana, which I actually found to be a really kind of remarkable opinion. I mean, it's certainly kind of fun to read, where essentially it was a Muslim woman, and there were Jewish women, and there was one person who doesn't belong to any particular organized faith, who essentially challenged the Indiana restriction on abortion. And the court actually held in their favor. I mean, this was a preliminary injunction, saying that there was a likelihood of success in the merits of their claim, that because there was a substantial burden on their ability to practice their faith, and that the government didn't have a compelling interest in the abortion ban, and so on and so forth, and there was no least restrictive means. And if you look at the way that the judge kind of explained these things, it was actually really interesting. And one of the things I think made it really interesting was just how much she was relying on Hobby Lobby to kind of support a lot of her points. And so Hobby Lobby being a case of the Supreme Court in 2014 that upheld the right of a fundamentalist Protestant family who runs the Hobby Lobby stores to not have to pay for a couple of drugs that were required under the contraceptive mandate. And specifically, the ones that they didn't want to pay for were the ones they considered to be abortifacients. And there was all this sort of scientific kind of responses to that based on different people. These aren't actually abortifacients. And I think the FDA recently has declared that Plan B is not an abortifacient. But the Supreme Court held that ultimately that is scientifically inconclusive, and it's something that for these people, they use religion to figure out, when life begins. And so similarly, it's you see that reliance in this case where the judge is the court said in Hobby Lobby that it's ultimately people with different religious beliefs are going to draw the line in different places. And so why are we going to accept the government's definition of when life begins? I think the other parts of it is just in the past few years, there's been a broadening, many would say, of religious liberty, jurisprudence and the protections for religious liberty. I think a lot of people on the left have grumbled about it. Certainly during the COVID pandemic, there was lots of it was a pretty concerted move toward what somebody calls, what scholars call the most favored nation approach, which is that if you made any exception to your COVID regulations, and you also had to extend it to religious organizations. And what's interesting is that all that law now is essentially being used to argue for these religious exemptions from abortion bans. It's well, you have an exception for when it impacts the health and of the mother, or like puts her, so creates a fatal risk, or et cetera, et cetera. If you have these exceptions, then you have to also extend it to these religious beliefs. So I think that it's more complicated than I think some people imagine, but this goes back to this idea that if we can all just sort of think about religious liberty as something that might actually protect political and religious beliefs that we deeply disagree with, then it becomes, I think it just, one, has more integrity, but it also just becomes like a much cooler topic to talk about.
So I want to talk about ways that your ideas might be challenged from people who are on the left and people who are on the right, or circumstances that might challenge this vision that you're laying out for religious liberty for all. On the left, and we've been talking about cases that deal with this, there's a sort of stereotype now. People who are high-up leaders at the ACLU have argued that religious liberty has actually become a code for defending certain viewpoints that discriminate against sexual minorities or that want to take away women's rights. This would be from the perspective of someone who is on the left. And I think religious liberty in certain ways has a branding problem because it is associated or has been pushed by people who are on the left as being something that's kind of code for hatefulness. I wonder how you think about that and respond to that characterization that is made by some who are on the left.
Yeah, and I think that branding problem is what I was referring to when I said, this whole sort of the way that religious liberty is being thought about in terms of these exemptions to abortion bans is like, just makes it cooler. Because I think that now it sort of complicates that. Like if you're going to advocate for these really broad protections for religion, that has to necessarily then extend to religious beliefs that might not have been contemplated at the time that we were engaging in this expansion. I think there is some resistance to that, I should just say, from scholars on the left, because they think that ultimately religious liberty law is just really something that the judges can manipulate, that they can kind of use it to favor the religions or the beliefs that they like and the ones that they don't like or don't consider to be sufficiently religious. But that question of judicial bias or selectivity aside, which I have ways to kind of counter some of those arguments as well. I think the fact is that the law is there, and we see this example, for example, in Indiana, where the law is being used by this judge in a way that's like surprising and very interesting, and certainly challenges this branding of religious liberty as just being for conservatives, as just being a mode of, to discriminate often, or for sort of conservative traditional beliefs, but not beliefs that we would categorize as progressive. So I really think it's an interesting chapter. And the way to continue to sort of build out that chapter is to, and you see some scholars on the left doing this, kind of like how can we use these protections for things that are not considered conservative, right? Providing food and water for migrants, even though that might violate the local law, for example. So I think, that's certainly one way, and I think that a lot of times when you have these cases being decided in favor of conservative Christians, I think the Kennedy v. Bremerton case was probably the one that had a lot of outroar, just sort of uproar, where
the coach who was praying on the field with his athletes.
Right, the Christian coach who was permitted to pray at the 50-yard line after a game was over, and a lot of people thought that was really coercive for people who weren't of the same faith. And the court held in his favor. But I think, so there tends to be this feeling that is the sort of thing that's being protected. But the more we can kind of use those things to create space for Jewish and Muslim and Buddhist teachers to be able to express their faith more openly as well, I think that's really the opportunity. Instead of kind of trying to limit the protections for religion, I think there just needs to be more active work to diversify who actually is feeling confident expressing their religion.
I want to just flag that we'll have an opportunity for questions in just a minute after I ask my next question. So be thinking of your questions, and I'll call on people from the audience. But before we get there, I want to just raise the question of plausibility and willingness of people who are in both constituencies to actually build the kind of coalition that you're describing. And I'll give two examples. On the left, you see among American Muslims a big political shift over the last 20 years to align with the Democratic Party, and not just the Democratic Party, During the 2020 and 2016 election cycles, Muslims were hugely important in the Bernie Sanders campaign. So this is not just the left, this is the left of the left. And when you think about political figures who have actually built power, who are Muslim, you think of Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Linda Sarsour. These are congresswomen, very important activists in the Muslim world. And these are women who are very much on the left. And I think if they were to contemplate your argument, they would disagree with you about the right way to build coalitions with evangelical Christians. But on the right, you have a somewhat mirror problem. And here comes to mind the question of the way that some evangelicals have tried to back Muslim religious liberty and have been rebuffed by their own constituencies. Russell Moore, who was in a political leadership role within the Southern Baptist Convention, tried to defend Muslims who were trying to build new mosques and ended up facing a huge backlash from the Southern Baptist Convention, from portions of his constituents who didn't believe that that was the right thing for the Southern Baptist Convention to do. So, in these two different ways, I think you see a constituency problem, which is there's mutual mistrust. A lot of evangelicals or conservative Christians don't trust or think that they should be defending the rights of Muslims. And a lot of Muslims don't think that conservative Christians really have their backs. So how would you deal with that kind of challenge?
Yeah, so in my second book, I talk about studies about black sheep and what that means, like people who just sort of set apart, intentionally set themselves apart from their particular political tribe. And so I dedicate the second book to the black sheep in a fitting in culture. And I think we have to rely on the black sheep, ultimately. That's the only way we're going to get past, not just the question of religious liberty polarization, but polarization more broadly. And in the book, I really kind of use the religious liberty case study as sort of a way to comment on the phenomenon of polarization more broadly. And I think you're exactly right. I think it hasn't been easy doing the work that I do and the types of things that I advocate. There are plenty of people who disagree on both sides, whether it be, Frank Gaffney calling me a Sharia supremacist and telling people not to listen to me because I'm coming under, the cloak of religious liberty to capture them. But there's definitely people on the other side who just think that this is a way of selling out. We have to position the people who are, they think of the people on the right as people who are always saying and doing really awful things about Muslims, and it's just like you can't in any way try to make peace with them, which is why I spend so much time in the book really kind of parsing which is a group of people that I think we can make peace with, and I intend in making very clear that Christian nationalists, who often get conflated with conservative Christians more broadly, are not the people that I'm talking about. And so and another reason I wrote the second book is because I do think there is something unique about religious liberty that can help us supersede these types of tribal approaches and sort of gut reactions where we just sort of look at other people, either we refuse to engage or to the extent that we're actually sitting there with someone who holds very different views, we're mostly just waiting for them to stop talking so that we can offer a rebuttal. And just saying that, look, this might be the issue. A lot of political scientists say that the way to overcome tribalism is to find a cross-cutting issue. But they're like, we don't really know what that cross-cutting issue is because there's just not enough trust of the governing institutions. And I continue to advocate that I think religious liberty has that potential. I think the people who are advocating for it, though, again, have to really kind of be dedicated to this idea that that is going to protect things that we don't agree with, that we don't like, but we're protecting it for the greater good.
All right, who has questions from the audience? There will be a student who runs around with a mic, so put your hand up and we'll get you there. Okay, we'll start down here in the blue sweatshirt. So, over on this side, yeah, great.
Hello, thank you so much for that talk. It was very insightful, very interesting. My question for you is more about the response you faced from kind of Orthodox American Muslim communities. When you started doing this work and encouraging conversation with those who we see are usually against the communities. So what kind of response did you face from your peers or from, the people in the community, the non-academic community?
The non-academic?
Or non-political, non-academic community.
When you said Orthodox, the earlier phrasings, and I think it's, I think the question of religious liberty is not something that for a long time, and even now, I would say a lot of American Muslim like American Muslim individuals and mosques and so on beyond like, the big civic organizations are really thinking about, right? They have started to kind of become more sort of aware of the issues. I think part of it is because they too are suddenly noticing that there are major changes in the country when it comes specifically to questions of sexual orientation, gender identity, and beginning to realize that there's something there where they have to kind of begin to carve out a space for themselves. And again, this is specifically in regard to our traditional Orthodox congregation, which I actually think are majority. I mean, our civic organizations are much more to the left compared to like the average mosque. And so the first response is like, I think the question of religious liberty isn't even something that for a long time people were thinking about. And I still remember like there was a video that was put out by this very, very influential scholar who's very conservative and has like millions of followers. And he put out this video after a Obergefell was decided. And Obergefell is a case that announced sort of a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And he's like, there's nothing to be alarmed about. This is what he told his very traditional followers. This is just the same as like alcohol. Like, we don't drink alcohol, but a lot of other people drink alcohol, so all you have to do is just abstain. And it's the same thing when it comes to same-sex marriage. I'm just like watching this, I'm like, this guy is like Yale PhD, like has studied at like, the most, luminous like Islamic seminaries, and I'm just like, I just didn't get that at all. And the fact that he didn't even think that it was any more complicated than that. Fast forward to 2020, I actually spoke at his mosque. And again, I'm going to try to avoid identifying this person, but he has, again, a big following, packed mosque, and I was talking about religious liberty and gay rights in this setting because suddenly he's like, oh, that's an issue we need to be talking about. So in that sense, it was very sort of open and accepting and giving me that platform. But still others, if you're going to talk about people who are more to the right of him, kind of like our equivalent of, I don't know, something maybe like a Jordan Peterson, but like a much more brash version. Like those people have come after me as like a total, like, somebody who's thrown Islam and under the bus. It's like, how could you even begin the conversation from a place of recognizing the humanity and the needs of LGBTQ individuals? Like that to me, that to them is a bridge too far.
Great question. I saw a question down here, if you'd still like to ask. Yeah, great. So right here in the white sweatshirt.
What was the argument behind the claim that Islam is not a religion and rather a political ideology?
What is the what?
Argument behind the claim that Islam is not a religion.
Well, I mean, so there was the one nonprofit that was created to actually try to back up this claim is called the Center for the Study of Political Islam, where they apparently went through all the hadith and Quranic verses and like actually categorized them, which I don't even understand how they got to like the full sort of set of, hadith. There's like just so many, but they essentially categorized them into like the religion bucket and then like the politics bucket or the non-religion bucket. And of course, the things they were putting there in the religion bucket was purely like, charity, prayer, like how to prepare for prayer, things like that. And anything that dealt with the public space was put in the other bucket. And based on this analysis, they determined that only 16% of Islam is a religion. And then this claim has been repeated by people in much more prominent positions. So that was one way they came up with that. The other way that this comes up is not with those precise words, but the anti-Sharia legislation movement, like in this country, which at this point there's been bills proposed in 43 states and actually enacted in a few states, also comes from the premise that like Sharia as Islamic law is really just a political, just purely political ideology. There's nothing really religious there, and there needs to be an attempt to stop the practice of Sharia, which on the ground just simply means whether or not Muslims can take their matters to a religious arbitration. And so it's come up in that form as well, that ultimately if we allow the ability for these people to arbitrate their personal issues according to their religious law, that it's somehow going to end up violating our human rights in this country. There's different places. I mean, people have challenged the ability of to wear a headscarf in the workplace, that this is somehow, Islamo-supremacism. I mean, that word supremacism comes up a lot. It's just like any sort of accommodation for a Muslim who wants to practice their faith is somehow giving the opening for their takeover of the United States. And these are the people who are behind the Ground Zero Mosque fiasco in New York City. You might remember that. That was the beginning of an anti-mosque movement that sort of swept the nation. The Islamic Center of Murfreesboro was the first one to be impacted in the aftermath of that conspiracy.
Other questions? Oh, there's so many. I love this. Okay, I'm going to privileged students. So here in the sweatshirt in blue. Oh, yeah. Sure, yeah.
So I know that you mentioned there being like kind of this increased convergence of conservative Christian ideology and really a lot of Muslim ideology as well. I know that over time, especially now that Trump is like not in office, we've kind of seen Islamophobia subside a little bit in politics especially, and I've noticed that like the Muslim vote actually started shifting a bit more conservative, especially in like 2020, for example. And do you feel generally that in the future it's more likely that with even like I guess more of an alliance between like Christian ideology and like also Islamic ideology, that we might see more conservative like political leanings among Muslims or among like, the community in general?
Well, I mean, so the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is a Muslim-run think tank, has polled Muslim Americans on some of these questions. So one of their recent reports found that 50% of American Muslims are interested in building coalitions with conservatives on questions of religious liberty, which I think even that is like, I still think that that's probably a really new idea, partly because of the sort of alarm that I mentioned before. About things that they're just sort of waking up to, but at the same time there was higher numbers in terms of Muslim Americans who wanted to build coalitions with the left on things like Black Lives Matters and other types of social justice issues. So I mean, according to that, I mean, yes, it is true that in the 2020 elections, the numbers or the percentage of American Muslims who voted for Trump actually went up compared to 2016. And a lot of people have sort of explained that because the fact that he was just really good for small businesses and just for people's financial interest. And just the makeup of the American Muslim community is that there are a lot of business owners and so on. So there are, in other words, there are issues aside from social issues that are kind of driving some of this trend. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's still, I think Pew has done a lot of polling, and it seems to me that certainly in the younger generations, and even among, honestly, like the older generations, 40 to 60, there's still like a very significant move toward ideas that are sort of embraced by the political left. I mean, much wider acceptance of gay marriage and so on. So I actually think the trend, like to the extent it's going to be like significant, it's going to be continuously leftward.
Good question. In the baseball cap, you still want to ask? Okay, great.
Hi. So Christians and Muslims share, I guess you could say, similar conservative ideologies. Have you noticed on the Christian side that the association with this antiquated relationship with terrorism and Islam has just not allowed Christians to, I guess, accept Muslims or try to see similarities in their views?
Yeah, and to be more specific, I mean, I don't think that there's this total. I think there's many Islams practiced by different Muslims, and many types of Christianities practiced by different Christians. But I think on the question, to the extent that there is a meeting of the minds, a lot of people think about the questions of social and public morality, sexual freedom, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, there are some really prominent people in conservative circles who have advocated for more sort of robust coalition building between Muslims and Christians, and they've continued to face a lot of resistance. And I think based on things like there is just a struggle to be able to see Muslims as something other than people to be resisted. But again, I mean, my experience on my book tour with the first book and what led me to write the second one is that there are enough people there who are willing to move past that, at least to the extent that they're willing to have a conversation and be open about these things. But one of the things I talk about in the politics of vulnerability is like this phenomenon of like competing victimhoods. Some people call it the victim Olympics, and it's just a lot of people kind of have a hard time letting go, sort of acknowledging other people's stories of victimhood or vulnerability, because somehow they feel like it kind of diminishes their own sort of claim to that. So I think a part of it is also like that's why you see so much like, don't talk about Islamophobia. That's mere political correctness. Islamophobia doesn't exist. I think one former columnist for the National Review wrote that it's Islamophobia, like F-A-U-X. It's not real. These things are just made up. And so there's just like this sort of consistent desire. Also, like, why are politicians on the left always sort of showing up for Muslims and kind of talking about when they're marginalized and discriminated against, but what about when the Christians are experiencing this? Why don't they show up for them? And it all just becomes a place where people are kind of like fighting about who gets more attention for their victimhood, as opposed to actually acknowledging that real things are happening.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Anybody have a really good one? Really good? Okay, you've been trying since the beginning. We'll do down here in the front. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, speak into the mic. Yep, thanks.
Apologies if this is a spicy question.
We love spicy questions.
I was wondering if Asma, and thank you for the talk and for the discussion, if Asma could share with us her thoughts about how she might explain the hijab to a niece or a daughter for the first time, and to a son or a nephew for the first time.
How I would explain the hijab?
Yes.
So for a long time, I was a research assistant for someone named Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, which some of you might know who he is. But I think just the way that he talks about hijab is really kind of one that resonated with me. And ultimately, it's about sort of protection of like the private space and kind of like, and ultimately, Quranically, that's also how it was revealed as a curtain to kind of protect the sort of sanctity of the private space. And I think, if you're gonna, that it has to, that ultimately today it's about sort of the sanctity of sort of your personal relationship with God and about protecting that and kind of using it as a way sort of to create that outer barrier between the external world that might get in the way of that relationship. And fully also I think if I talk about it, recognizing that what the hijab has become in modern day America, across the world, is something very different for many people, that it really has become a symbol of identity. And I think for a lot of people that can kind of begin to diminish the spiritual role that it plays and complicates it. And also, of course, the fact that once you put it on, I mean, certainly my experience when I used to wear it was that I was just expected to be the public spokesperson, like for all things happening in the Muslim world, no matter where I was. And so that is a sort of burden that I think a lot of women take on when they decide to wear it.
Well, Asma, although you are not the spokesperson for every Muslim across the entire world, you are a great spokesperson for Asma, and your ideas are really interesting and fabulous, and I hope that you all can join me in thanking her for sharing some of our ideas today.
Great, thank you.
And on behalf of the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center, Asma, Emma, thank you both so much for being here. And I would encourage everyone to please go buy Asma's books and read them. They're fascinating and just wonderful. And please read Emma in The New Yorker. She is one of the best there is in the country. And thank you again, both of you, for being here.